To you, for those I haven't seen, and welcome to our guests, Gareth Jones, Dave Leach and Sian Hughes from Coleg Gwent. We're just waiting for Nick to come and sit down, is that okay? That's no problem, Nick. Take your time. No problem. Take your time. Okay?
Yes.
Right. Well, may I welcome everyone, our committee members and the officers, to the Prosperous Communities Overview and Scrutiny meeting. Remind you that this meeting is being webcast, so therefore can I ask you to turn your phones off or place them on silent, and please, when you speak, ensure that you speak clearly into your microphones. As a council, we welcome the use of the Welsh language within our public meetings, but I confirm that I've had not any notification or request to use Welsh language today. Therefore, the meeting will be conducted in English only. Can I also remind you to please sign the attendance registers, and now I'm going to ask Chris if we have any apologies from members for this meeting.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Sue Malson.
Okay. And I am aware that Councillor Ashley may be late. Okay? Right. Do we have any declarations of interest, please?
Yeah.
Okay? Right. Before we start, we have some guests with us. I think it might be appropriate to do an introduction, so should we go round the table and introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, Councillor Vic Jones. Councillor Steve Evans.
Good morning, Councillor Veronica Craig.
Councillor Faye Jones.
Councillor Chris Hill.
Good morning, I'm Sian Hughes. I'm based in the Pontypridd campus and I'm Head of Learner Services for Coleg Gwent.
Good morning, I'm Dave Leach, Head of Economy and Skills at Torfaen.
Good morning, my name is Gareth Jones. I'm the Engagement and Progression Coordinator, which basically means I coordinate the support for NEET young people within Torfaen.
I'm Chris Slade, I'm Democratic Services Officer, I'm taking the minutes.
And I'm Councillor Jan Jones.
I am Rebecca Scrutiny Support Officer.
Before we start, can I ask members if they will quickly go through the minutes of the last meeting and consider any options for either for accuracy or confirm that the minutes are a true record of that meeting. Steve, okay?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Right. If we go on to item 4, I'm going to ask Rebecca if she can update us on the actions outstanding.
Thank you, Chair. So the only action detailed on the action sheet is the response to the recommendations from the last meeting, which you should have all received prior to the Christmas break. So unless members have any questions, I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Are you all satisfied? Okay. Right. We're now going to proceed with item 5. NEET's 2018 to 2019 performance and 2019 to 2020 risk controls in Torfaen. The report is intended to give members a broad understanding on the cause of and the Council's response to young people at risk of being NEET, not in education, employment or training within Torfaen. This includes an appraisal of the barriers, both general and those specific to Torfaen, that as risk young people face in securing post-16 provision. I take this opportunity to welcome Gareth and Dave Leach, the Head of Economy Skills and Engagement Progression, to the meeting, and I know I'm going to ask you both if you will sort of give us a brief overview of the report before we commence in questions. Okay? Thank you. I'll ask Dave to start first.
Thank you very much, Chair. So what we've tried to do with this report is we've tried to outline the processes that the teams take when it comes to looking at needs. We've then moved on to look at the partnerships, because a lot of the activity that's delivered around needs is done in partnership. I've provided then a summary of our service delivery model, which I'll talk you through very briefly in a second. And then we've gone on to look at the resources used and the performance of the teams in relation to needs figures. And finally, we have looked at what the likely risks are to needs provision going forward, and what actions have been taken at the minute to mitigate against those risks. So very briefly, just wanted to talk through some of the processes and partnerships, because the key for us is making sure that we're identifying young people early. We want to make sure that we're giving the best possible opportunities to all young people, and that means we need to know which ones are at risk of becoming neat very early in the process. We then support by brokering and coordinating support. Now, I'm sure we'll go into it in more detail. We do provide 2 support projects, and I'm sure there'll be questions on those, but the broader role of the team is around brokering that support from other organisations as well. Then we move through to tracking, which is about, once we've identified those young people who are at risk, how do we track those risks? How do we see whether there's any improvement in their behaviour, their attendance, some of the triggers that might lead us to believe that they're likely to be neat at the end of their time in school, or before they reach the age of 25. We then look at providing provision, and as I say, that's the project work that we do, which is very tailored to the individual. We then look around employability skills and opportunities for employment. So not only how do we prevent people becoming neat in its broadest sense, but how do we try and target people into employment and into making sure they have the right skills to enter that employment. And finally, we look to monitor the outcomes of those young people as well. So one of the messages that will come across as we go through the report is the tracking of young people once they've left at 16, if they stay with the project teams up until 19 and beyond. So those are the key elements of information, really. The performance information is set out in section 2.2.11, which identifies a similar performance actually this year to last year's. The reason that the figures are unverified at the minute is there is a process that Careers Wales go through about sorting out and reviewing the data. So that normally takes up until February, and the figures do change as part of that review process. What we think we've presented here is a cautious view rather than an overly optimistic one. And as I say, happy to answer any questions on any of the performance information or any of the risks that we feel there are going forward.
We have some questions that we will ask, but I will ask Gareth to come in, and possibly Charlie, she will give us some input as well. Is that okay? So Gareth?
Thank you. I think Dave has covered the vast majority of the rationale for the report. Obviously, I manage some of the practical activities, if you like, in terms of supporting young people within school prior to them leaving school at year 11, and then programmes and provisions that are supporting young people post-16. As Dave mentioned, it's not just the projects that I manage and we have, which are European funded. There's a range of other partner projects that we work very closely with, because ultimately, even though the local authority is responsible for this measure, it wouldn't be achieved, to be honest, if we didn't have the partnership working from a range of other providers as well, particularly people like Careers Wales, the schools specifically, the colleges, training providers. So if you like, oiling the wheel which links young people to other providers as well. But again, as Dave mentioned, I'm more than happy to take questions on both the numbers and the specifics, and some of the programmes of support, and maybe some aspects in terms of where we go next, if that makes sense.
Just briefly, because obviously I can only speak to the college's involvement in this. We do attend the Torvine KIP meetings, which are referred to in the document, and we also have the Inspire programme, which is in the document, based within the college, and that works very successfully between the college provision and the Torvine provision. And also the other aspect for us is the transition and movement of pupils into the FE system. So I'm happy to answer questions on those aspects.
Have some set. Sorry, I keep forgetting to turn that on. It's a case of getting old, I think. But we'll go through the questions and perhaps intern you'd like to give an input on it. So our first question comes from Councillor Steve Evans, please.
The relevant paragraph is 1.1. So there are two separate programs designed for the different characterizations. Can you expand on this?
Of course, yes. So there's two programmes that the council actually runs. These are both EU-funded support programmes. One's called Inspire to Achieve, and the other's called Inspire to Work. In a nutshell, I suppose, the focus of Inspire to Achieve is about managing young people who are at risk of becoming NEET. So that's around providing the support when they're in school, to make sure that we're tackling the risk factors and the barriers that are likely to prevent them going into employment or training. That is undertaken by a team, and I'll pass over to Gareth in a second to tell you a bit more about the work of the team. That's undertaken by a team of staff, and the support that's provided is very bespoke. So it can be one-to-one support, it can be group support, and there's outcomes, quite hard outcomes, that the team are looking to achieve, which are designated by the EU funders. Inspire to Work then supports people who have left education at 16 but still aren't in further education or training, and that is more around providing them with either the employability skills or the qualifications that they're going to need to go straight into further training or employment. So that support is far more focused around particular qualifications that they may need or a particular gap in their skill set rather than that broader intervention. So it may be something, for example, around construction safety scheme cards. It may be something around health and safety training for catering, something very particular to an area of work that they're interested in going into. The other element of Inspire to Work then is around young people who haven't quite reached that point where they have an aspiration or an idea as to where they want to go, and it's around broadening their views around what the world of work can offer. So there's programmes that run through Inspire to Work around, for example, an allotment project, around bike projects, around arts projects, around barista coffee training, which are all designed to broaden that sort of career ambition, that understanding of some of the entry-level opportunities that might be out there.
I'll just speak a little bit more in detail if I can without becoming too overbearing. In terms of the Inspire to Achieve project, as Dave was mentioning, all these projects are additional to what should be provided anyway, if you like, in relation to what schools provide, the Education Authority provides, the job centres. Everybody is established, if you like, to try and provide that. We act, I think, as some of the glue, I suppose, in relation to working with referred young people in schools, where the schools believe that by linking them to our programme and linking them to whatever activity we can to support them, will provide an opportunity for them, one, to engage better within school, secondly, to potentially achieve additional qualifications that they may not have achieved anyway, but everything to some degree then culminating in when they leave school in year 11 to hopefully be in a position where they transfer, they progress successfully into something. Now, when I say something, it depends really obviously on what the young people want and what's available, and that's the other factor in terms of what provision is around locally. We work with approximately, we've got targets, anything which is associated with European funding will have targets, and so we've got targets in the Inspire to Achieve project. We're working with young people where we try and improve the risks or remove the risks of them becoming NEET, to achieve certain qualifications, and, for example, to improve key aspects like attendance, like behaviour. As I said before, we're additional to what the authority provides anyway. Inspire to Work, clearly in terms of Inspire to Achieve, we want to make sure that the youngsters that we work with at 16, when they leave school, progress successfully. And nothing gives me greater pleasure, to be blunt, than when we see young people we've worked with some difficulties, with some issues, progress into provision, whatever that provision is, be it FE, into work, sixth forms, whatever they can access effectively. Inspire to Work, there's two projects which effectively are European funded, targeting 16 to 24-year-olds, and that is Inspire to Work and Communities for Work. I'm sure you're probably aware of the Communities for Work project as well, which is sort of an arm of Community First, if you remember the Community First project. We target young people that are unemployed in non-Community First areas, and then we work very closely with Communities for Work team who target young people who are unemployed in Community First areas. In terms of targets, we have targets to get 50% of those young people to get an appropriate qualification. We also have targets of 20% of those young people to get into employment and or further education or training. So quite specific targets, if you like, rather than just mentoring young people and working with young people. They're quite driven by things which we hope will support them to progress. So those are the main European projects. There are a couple of other ones actually supported outside the local authority, supported by the Welsh Council for Voluntary Action, but they're very niche projects. Obviously, you're probably aware all these European projects will finish effectively around December 2022. Yes.
We met with two young people yesterday, and we were very, very impressed, with the support they were getting and the chance to use these as life skills and, to progress on into employment. Considering their backgrounds were, in school were quite difficult and challenging. So we do see it is working, and they were a good example to see that the system is good for all young people.
Sorry. There was a third one which unfortunately is in work and couldn't tell me. I said unfortunately, should have said wrong words really. The three young people we effectively chose because of the issues that they've gone through. Shay, who you met, is still in school, and a smashing boy, but a number of issues associated with his progression. And the other young person, we've put a lot of different things in place to support them in terms of paying for courses, providing some one-to-one support. As David mentioned earlier, when we have young people referred to us, obviously it's incumbent upon us to know exactly what the issues are, to then see what we can do to support them, rather than just putting something on for the hell of it, if that makes sense. So I'd like to think they're only examples of other things, but they're two absolutely smashing boys. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Hi, I was just going to ask you about the nuts and bolts really of your project. What age do you first pick them up at, and what sort of work do you do with them? Obviously they're going to try BTECs, GCSEs, things like this, but do you do motivational work, psychological sort of work to help them to understand where they're coming from and where they could be going to, and do you work within the home as well?
The last one is a very implicit question. Is it working within the home? It's a needs-led project. If I deal with Inspire to Achieve first, that's the one based in school, it's a little bit more straightforward. The age we primarily work with is 11 to 16. It's a regional project, so there are other local authorities part of it. Sean mentioned actually Coleg Gwent have a 16-plus project, so youngsters at risk of dropping out of Coleg Gwent, for example, and in Merthyr College and Coleg Cymoedd, they're also part of it. They have a slight, it's different because it's different ages, but it's the same principle. It's about supporting young people at risk who might be dropping out of the college. In terms of our Inspire to Achieve project, we have young people referred to us really from 11 up. So in other words, as soon as they go into the secondary school, that's the age where schools are starting to look at the young people they're working with, and clearly they are responsible primarily, if not exclusively, as part of the authority to support them, but they're looking to see if there's anything that an organisation, and a team or an organisation like ourselves can provide additional support for. So going back to what we provide, we, again, as you'd imagine with European funding, there's a lot of paperwork involved, a lot of assessment involved, and we use all the recommendations from the school, plus then working directly with the young person, to put together some sort of additional package, if you like. We don't replace the school's education, that's not what we do. To be honest, we are not resourced to even contemplate that, and I don't think we should do that, because I think it's the authority and education responsibility to take that forward. But in terms of the individual support, we do have targets, but it depends on the young people and why they've been referred. So, for example, if a young person is referred because of poor attendance, we would try and look to see what we can develop which might increase the attendance. One of the things we've been, I suppose, creative about is looking to develop different projects, different activities. We set up the Changing Gears project a little while ago, which is to do with bikes. You can see by looking at me, I don't use those bikes that often, unfortunately. But a lot of these activities are not for my pleasure. They're basically based on what we think will engage young people. Dave mentioned some other ideas and some other activities. So we've looked at, for example, things like a range of art activities, a range of one-to-one support where we get a young person through a particular qualification, because some young people thrive on groups. The majority of the young people referred to us are not really big into groups. They're not, again, I'm generalising, but they're not often the best attendants in school. You asked a question about working with them in the home. It's a really interesting question. Obviously, we work with the young people that are referred to us. It's not an open access provision, so in other words, it's not like a youth club or something like that. So basically, the young people are referred to us for a reason. We might have a short, sharp intervention with them, depending on the needs, and that, to be blunt, that would be my perfect solution, is with a short, sharp intervention, whatever it is, then the young person integrates back in the school and they never need us again. And that's helpful because obviously there are a lot of young people who need additional support. There are some issues with young people who are educated or withdrawn from school. By that I mean there are an increasing number of young people who are sort of educated at home. We can work with them and we can take referrals, but again, who are the referrals from really? Because normally we have referrals from school. And I think that is, for me, a little bit of... we do try and provide as much support as we can for that specific group, but I think that's probably a gap somewhere in relation to how many young people are being educated or not, as the case may be, at home for whatever reason. But again, it is, without going overboard, it is a needs-led type of project, but we try and develop a range of engagement activities, because some of the young people are incredibly shy. They're not people who like to socialise at all. Others definitely do like to socialise, and their behaviour is interesting, to say the least. So there's a range of different rationales why they're referred, and then what we try and do is work with them individually. I hope that once we can work with a young person from year 7, effectively, or to year 11, I hope that we don't, to be honest, because obviously my objective is to work with them for a period of time, have a positive intervention with them, and have them engage elsewhere. We work very closely with other organisations like the LAC team, with the YOS team, because again there are other agencies, as you know, who are working with a small group of young people linked to those agencies. But again, if they're eligible and they can be referred and people think that we can benefit them, the young people, then I'll definitely take them within the capacity of the project. In terms of how we support them, we've got a member of staff linked to each of the schools. We have a base which was Changing Gears. I called it the Inspire Centre because it's a better name, to be honest. It's more generic, I think, reflects the project. But that's provision that we can use to have young people at. We can buy into some provision using the resources we've got, so we can buy into professional artists, we can buy into musicians. Basically anything we think of, excuse me, that we think will engage a particular young person. And they're all different, you know. There's 1,050 odd who left school in year 11 last year, and every single one of them have got different interests and different needs and issues, if you like. In terms of the ones post-16, Inspire to Work, for example, and or Communities for Work, the referrals can be self-referrals. So if a young person is unemployed, they can say, well, I could do with some extra support. But generally speaking, the referrals would come from Job Centre Plus, particularly 18 plus 18 to 24. We get referrals from Careers Wales as well, if they are working with Careers Wales. We also have, Sean mentioned the Keeping in Touch group. We've established something where effectively all the young people aged 16 to 19 that are on the Careers Wales database that are classified as either unknown or NEET. They're discussed every month. We look at the young people's names, we look at where they've worked. We have a range of people around the table, from the college, from training providers, from European projects, from the YOS team, from social services, and we look at who's worked with them, whether they would benefit from being having their door knocked on, to be blunt, and whether we can chase them and track them. Ultimately, post 16, a young person engagement with us is voluntary, so they can say, "Ta-ra, we don't need you." There's no mandatory engagement, but obviously, I hope that all the agencies, including the Inspired to Work project that I manage, are good engagers with young people to get them involved if they want to. Some of the young people's their issues are so difficult, thankfully not too many of them, but that we need to try and engage in them constantly. But we don't give up on a young person ever. So we can sometimes park them if they don't want our support. But every month we discuss those young people, aged 16 to 19, who are unemployed or unknown, and then we look to see what other provision we can put in place to support them. And I've got, in terms of Inspired to Work, I've got 4 or 5 staff that target those young people, and I think Communities for Work have similar provision. And then we have some supported funding that we can use to pay for courses. Dave mentioned, for example, we've got a number of young people into employment by paying for the CSES card, which is something that you need to go onto a construction site, for example. Some of the courses are really expensive. We've paid for people to do forklift driving. We've paid for people to even do HGV licence. But that was a one-off, thankfully, because I couldn't afford that. It was about maybe £2,000 or something. But the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is it is a needs-led process. And if we have the capacity to provide the support to get them to progress, then we'll do it. And we'll go above and beyond, to be honest, even if we don't have the money ourselves, to see who else we can refer them to. We've had a couple of people set up in employment as well by looking at self-employment. So it does depend on the young people themselves, but...
I think that's the key for us, is tapping into that interest. So understanding what the interest is of that individual, what's going to motivate them to stay engaged with employment or training. Because one of the things that we find quite often is that people are quite detached and are motivated to go into further education or further training. And that's why we need to really hit home on that interest. So that's the key, is having the flexibility to be able to target it at what they're interested in, and then build on that interest to then take it into something that's employability and qualification based.
Interests that we work with young people are very realistic. They want to work on a site, so we support them with the CSS. Sometimes the young people have no idea what employment is about, and they are unrealistic in their expectations. Obviously, there are agencies like Careers Wales who are there to support some of that. But again, we work even beneath or below them, if you like, by actually targeting young people, even if they're not engaging with Careers Wales. But it is about motivating, an awful lot of our work is about motivating young people, to be honest.
That was a very great answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. It's been you're really comprehensive of what you do. So we can on now to ask Councillor Crick to give us our second question, please, which I think you partially answered, but.
I think if you just clarify, really, so that we're all quite clear. Looking at paragraph 1.2, how become aware that a young person is at risk of becoming neat? You say you're looking at them really from year 7 onwards, aren't you?
Because there's a lot of factors associated with a young person being at risk, if you like, then we work very closely with the schools, the education department, in looking at what factors are likely to be impacting. I mean, the vast majority of young people have little or no problems in progressing through education, to be blunt. And that's reflected in the figures, which is really good, I think, in person. Yeah. But there are young people who, for whatever reason, have issues. We use something called the risks. It's a needs indicator, effectively, by looking at a various range of factors. We call it the RONI, but risk of needs indicator is just a word. And what we do as part of that, Ronnie, I'm more than happy to send that to you as a piece of evidence. It's just one sheet of A4, but that covers a range of different things that we think potentially have an impact on whether a young person is going to be more likely at risk. And again, I don't want to go in terms of looking at point scoring, but obviously from our own simplistic point of view, we look at sort of thresholds where if you score so many points, then you're definitely at risk. Simplistically, you don't have to showcase any of these things, to be at risk, because there could be something within you that it hasn't come out yet. But on a very simplistic level, we use, in partnership with the schools, in terms of the referrals, because at risk of NEETs are generally those people in school. NEETs are obviously those who post-16, sorry to be obvious, but
Yeah.
so the ones who they are, go on.
Interrupt you, sorry. You're saying about the Ronnie which you use and you link closely with the schools. So are the schools aware of the Ronnie as well, and they have a copy so that they can almost pinpoint when they're referring to you and talking to you?
This is done in collaboration with the schools. Lindsay, who's a member of the team, works very, very closely with the schools and with Careers Wales to identify the young people who the schools feel at risk, as well as those who are on the Ronnie. And then there has been a sort of almost cross-referencing system between the ones that the schools feel are at risk, the ones that the Ronnie has identified. Yeah, and actually that's spot on. 9 times out of 10, the lists are the same. So the systems are there to make sure that no one's falling through the cracks in terms of that early identification process.
And the referrals come directly from the schools. So we don't make a decision to say, we'll have those young people, please. Effectively, the schools refer the young people. We have a member of staff in each of the schools. We've been running the Inspire to Achieve project probably for 3 or 4 years. Prior to that, we had the Prevent project, which you may remember, which had similar expectations, if you like, again, European funded. The YEP process, so the systems in terms of the relationships with the schools, we've probably been running that now for, say, a good 5 or 6 years. And I don't think we can ever be complacent about it, but I think we've built the relationship. I mean, people do change, obviously, but systems generally, hopefully, don't. The relationship between ourselves and the schools are absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the project to be.
Okay, Veronica? Thank you. Question comes to myself. Following working with a young person, how long after do we track them to assess the progress and success of the intervention into work?
I was just going to give a brief overview. One of the advantages of having the 2 projects is that if we've got young people coming through Inspire to Achieve, if they go through that process and remain neat at the time that they've come out of that, we're able to pick them up through the Inspire to Work programme and continue to track and support them. So there's that continuous tracking and support from Year 7 all the way through to age 25 if they remain engaged with the project. But there's also potential, and this is an area that we're looking to join up even better, there's potential for even longer term tracking once they get into employment, between, say, the ages of 16 and 25. Beyond that, through Working Skills for Adults, which is one of our employability programmes focused on adult support. So the aim there is these are all EU-funded programmes to make sure that we've got that continuous tracking all the way through. And there's a reason for that beyond just tracking outcomes, which is that one of the objectives of the Working Skills for Adults programme is to find people who are in employment and upskill them within their employment so that they can go on to higher level jobs within that employment. So it's not for us just about being able to place a young person in any old employment. There is an element where we need to do that at the start, but we don't then abandon that at that point. We then look to provide the skills once they get into employment. It's not infallible. We can't track everyone. It's only if they remain engaged with the projects that we can do that. But it's something that we want to continue doing going forward.
Can I just briefly add to that?
Yes,
sorry,
please.
Chair. In relation to the progression from Inspire to Achieve to Inspire to Work, as I mentioned earlier, thankfully very few young people leave school at year 11 and become NEET, and I'm really grateful for that, as we all should be. And some would have done that automatically, the vast majority, whether we support them or not, in fairness. The issue for us is, if they do, as Dave mentioned, still remain an issue, they have problems, when we would know about them, certainly up until the age of 19. We use Careers Wales' Scholar IO database, which basically has a record of all the young people in school and then keeps a record of them as they progress up to the age of 19. At 19, there's a falling off the cliff to some degree, because obviously then it becomes the responsibility of DWP and the job centre, and information sharing, which is a key aspect of our work. That is, we can get information on young people and we can share information. Post-19 is a little bit more complicated. But certainly what you will find with a vast number of young people aged 16 to 19, that they go in and out of activity. And so hopefully the majority of young people progress into something at 16, and to be blunt with you, never darken our day again. But the issue for us is, if they do, and if they become unknown, then they come up for every monthly keeping in touch meeting, and then we look at tracking them, chasing them, knocking on doors. I wouldn't say it's like Big Brother, but sometimes I would say we go above and beyond, and I think sometimes we've not had the police called on us yet, if that makes sense. Because obviously there's something, to some degree, somebody could turn around and say, well, what are you knocking on my door for? What do you want from me? The vast majority of parents, for example, again, I'm just going on experience, are supportive of that process, and so they are grateful. I know that sounds pejorative, but they're grateful that we are paying some attention and are interested. But obviously some not so, thankfully very, very few. But again, we don't leave it, if you like, in relation to just presuming that they're in something. But as I said before, thankfully the vast majority of kids we work with in school, Inspire to Achieve, never become part of Inspire to Work or Communities for Work, because they progress, and that's what I want.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to ask Faye now, and she's going to do questions 5 and 6, a big one, 4 and 5, they link up together. Okay.
Thank you. Hi. Leading on from what we've said, and we have touched on it a little bit, I just wondered, could you tell us more about young persons who may be unknown to us? I know that's a difficult bit. And then, as the unknown figures are not included in the official NEETs figures, what is to stop us declaring higher numbers, basically? And I'm really interested in this because I did run a project working with NEETs, first of all at primary level, or at risk of being NEETs, and then again older in 2 different authorities, which were pilot projects that went on for many years, which I know the government looked into quite a lot. So I'm really interested to see it now. It sounds like it's really working well on the ground.
If I can just give a quick summary, and then you can fill any gaps that...
Dave knows I will just talk for everyone on this point, that's right.
The reason I'm jumping in, actually, is I want to say that you asked around what's to stop us just classifying people as unknown, and I think the reality is it's the moral compass and drive of that team, that they don't see this as an indicator for Welsh Government and for others. They see these as individual young people, and if you speak to any member of that team, they are passionate that every individual young person that they are working with, they should know about them, they should know what they're going on to do, they should be able to find a place. And they take it quite personally if they're not able to place someone and someone falls into those figures. So there is nothing to stop us classifying people as unknown, except for the drive that we wouldn't want to do it. There is a balancing act there, which is that some people are genuinely unknown. We have gone through the process that Gareth talked about. We've knocked on doors, we've made telephone calls. Odds are they've moved out of county, they've moved somewhere where we're never going to be able to get in touch with them. And unfortunately, there are 1 or 2 every year who fall into that category that we simply cannot track down. So we will see figures of unknown. But the reason that we have such a low target, the target is 0 for unknowns, is that we want to keep the team motivated with that intention of driving it as close to 0 as we possibly can.
I want to, because as I say, I do get irked by this a little bit. Obviously the local authorities only measure on NEET numbers. Unknowns need to be measured, but they're not counted in terms of the NEET figures, which is basically what you mentioned. If you look at the NEET figures each year in each local authority, and you see where we are in the pecking order, if you like, and then you look at the unknown figures linked to each local authority, it really irritates me when you see an authority who's doing better than us in terms of NEET figures. Obviously 1 or 2 young people make a big difference in terms of the percentage, but their unknown figures are incredibly high. Because bluntly, as Dave mentioned, you can literally say, I'm not going to bother, I'm not going to track them down, because we are not measured officially on that figure. Now again, I would like to think, I hopefully I'm right, but we're not the only moral compass, and other 21 local authorities also have people that want to find where these young people are, and I think in the vast majority of cases it is. The other thing, obviously, which is for me important, is the local authority is measured on this, but clearly we're also beholden to a range of other people to ensure that they provide that support, be it Creers Wales, whoever, to make sure that we are measured on that, but they're quite crucial as well. But in terms of the need figures, yes, we do monitor them. We do. In terms of unknown, I hate having unknown figures. It breaks my heart to have unknown figures. This year, I think we had 4 unverified data at the moment. We had 4 out of this year's year 11 leavers, out of about 1,050. We had 0 with year 12, which I'm pleased about, and 1 with year 13. The older the young person gets, I know it sounds obvious, the more difficult it is actually to track them, because they've likely progressed somewhere and possibly in some cases literally moved away. But the 4 young people this year that were unknown by November the 1st, we will still maintain them in the keeping in touch figures each month, and we will still try and nag, we will still try and knock on the door, we will still try and find them through social media, anything, to be honest with you. But ultimately, as Dave mentioned, some literally disappear. We've been to houses where they've just moved, but at least we do knock on the door, at least we do make every opportunity to phone. I mean, the other thing with mobile phones these days, to be honest with you, people are changing mobile phones every 5 minutes. So that's why we don't rely on the phone calls and we knock on the doors.
The other thing to point out, just in relation to the unknown figures for 2018, you'll see a spike there in unknown figures, not particularly for us, but across the board in terms of the local authorities. The reason for that was the introduction of GDPR. In order to get the unknown figures down, we need access to data. And for us to access data under GDPR, we need appropriate information sharing protocols. Once GDPR was introduced, we had to update all of the information sharing protocols with all of the third parties who we work with, particularly with areas around Creers Wales and accessing some of the information there. So there's a noticeable spike across the board there. That's the explanation for that spike.
Can you get back into it?
Just thinking on that, I obviously work in a multi-agency area. Do you ever have the police come into you perhaps to work with certain individuals or to look for individuals, or is that so outside your remit it doesn't happen? And do you have much, it wouldn't be child protection because possibly they're older, but do you have much in that sort of area?
Yes is the answer to your question, because again, any agency that impacts on those young people, we will potentially work with, or they will come to us. So from a school environment, if you like, we have our own meetings with the schools, multi-agency basis, and we used to call it, we are looking at different ways of looking at multi-agency work. The MAPI meetings are something that I don't know if you're aware of this, that the schools do with the police on many occasions, and community safety. We've decided that we will attend those rather than have our own meetings, because to be honest, we were finding that there's so many potential multi-agency meetings that people, you may as well go to one and you'll be able to discuss everybody more or less, rather than having staff to go all over the place. So I think from my point of view, the links to the police, both within the school, very closely with the OS worker. The OS worker is education and employment worker. That person attends our KIT meeting. That person will refer youngsters to us that they're working with in school. I haven't had a referral directly from the police yet, but ordinarily, if they're involved with the police, they are probably, certainly if they're on order, a link to the Youth Offending Service. And we've got quite a number of young people, thankfully not major numbers, but certainly the majority of young people they work with are also referred to us to see if we can provide extra resources. I can probably say we've probably got 5 or 6 young people that are linked to YOS now that we are working with as part of a programme. So we're not providing everything for that person, but we are providing something as part of their overall education or training, if that makes sense.
Just to pick up very briefly on the other part around child safeguarding, we do get referrals through for looked after children.
Yeah.
In particular, it's one of the categories that comes up on our risk of need indicator. We work really closely with the social services and the support agencies around that, all of the team have done safeguarding training to make sure that they're equipped to identify any child safeguarding concerns that might come up.
And we on as well, obviously, if they come to us for.
Yeah, just to add to that, all the heads of learning services in college are the safeguarding leads for the campuses, and I speak to TIPS about once a week, if not more often. So for our Inspire referrals, I would have data from TIPS before the learner actually comes in, and we would look to put Inspire support around them as soon as they come into college.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're passing all these questions on to you, but no specific order, so whoever wants to come in and take the lead on it, we're very, very grateful. So, please.
The question I got, these projects are funded until 2022. You know, what are we doing when this funding is ceased?
So one of the actions that we've got as a team this year is to produce a business plan that sets out what our options are around a needs support package going forward. I think we identified in the report there's likely to be a key decision that needs to be made by Council around what level of resourcing and support can be provided. Now our hope is that there will be a replacement programme to the current EU funding. There's been talk for quite some time around a shared prosperity fund, which is a UK government initiative looking to replace EU funding. What that will look like, we simply don't know yet. There are discussions taking place at a regional level around prioritisations. We're feeding into those discussions through myself, through chief officers and through all of the systems that we have available to emphasise the importance of employability projects and specifically employment support towards needs. So we're hopeful that those will form a part of the employability programme. The worst case scenario for us, Gareth's sort of element of this, the Youth Engagement and Progression Coordinator, there is some funding from Welsh Government towards that function. It's a small amount, it's enough for one role, and that's around that coordination and tracking. That would then put us into a similar situation for the authorities who don't receive EU funding, so all of the support projects under those circumstances would drop away, and that's what we're trying to avoid, because I think what we hope that the team have achieved is changing the nature of the people who are NEET in Torfaen and really driving those numbers down to a level that is much more sustainable from where they were. So we will fully business plan this, and we'll be presenting essentially an options appraisal within the next year and a half.
Yes, and Dave is right in this fact. Effectively, this project is 100% ESF funded. I'm 100% ESF funded. But as part of the ESF funding projects, you generally have to find match funding. What we've been able to do, though, is provide match funding using staff associated with similar types of roles. So, for example, in our project in Torfaen, we use some staff time of the youth service. That is where some of the youth workers are doing similar work, not exactly the same, but similar work. We can match in those elements or those bits of their time where they might be spending some time in school, for example, because the youth service does do some work in school, so we will match that.
And I'm going to ask Chris to come in.
In 222, 50,000 from the NSPPP budget. How secure is this funding? Is this also at risk of being cut?
So the funding that's been match funding this project has been secured, is committed to this project for the duration of the project. We needed to make sure when we submitted a funding bid that we had an understanding as to where the match funding would come from. What will happen with that beyond the end of that project, I don't know. The decision that's been taken so far is to support up to the end of the project that we've got currently.
Nick, you want to come in next, please?
Yes, good morning. 2.23 in the report there. You're talking about some risk factors as to stopping people actually progressing through into EET. I was wondering if you could sort of, I know you've touched on it sort of very, very briefly, but if you could just sort of elaborate on that just a little bit of where you see some of the risks are.
I mentioned some of those aspects in terms of the risk, particularly within the school scenario. In terms of referrals to, for example, the Inspire to Achieve project, they are based on some of the key factors which we think we can have an influence on. So I very straightforwardly, there is part of the report which I think indicates some of the reasons why some of the young people are neat, for example, now. So there might be health factors, they might be affected by certainly the barriers associated with attendance and behaviour. We've noted that some of the young people, when I say they're not reaching their potential, it sounds a bit vague, but basically within the school scenario, if they're not achieving at their expected level, that's another factor which might be a risk factor associated with this. In terms of the referrals to us as a project, the risk of needs indicator tool that we use is actually a very comprehensive tool, which I'll forward through the chair if that's okay, which does take into account a range of different issues, including, for example, if they are part of linked to the OS team, if they are LAC. It doesn't mean to say that a young person who is LAC is going to be neat. It just means that these are factors which might lead to a potential more likelihood of certainly factors impacting on the young person's development. So the risk of needs indicator covers a whole range of in-school issues and out-of-school family and other issues which, again, if you be kind enough, I'll certainly submit it by tomorrow for you to give you quite a comprehensive range of risk factors that we use. Obviously, what we can't do in terms of the project is be seen to be impacting on all of those things, because if a young person is LAC, and that's a risk factor, we don't impact on that, but we can work with the young person if they're referred to us who is LAC, if there are other issues other than the fact that they're LAC.
Yeah, there's two slightly, and it's a real nuance, there's two slightly different elements. So there's the risk factors we identify on the Ronnie, on the toolkit. That allows us to engage with those young people. We know that they've got risk factors there. The individual barriers that they then face that the project tries to address are slightly different. So it may be that they have numerous risk factors, they may have been an early leaver from school, they potentially have eligibility for free school meals. These are some of the things that are considered at that appraisal stage, but those aren't the barriers that are stopping them getting into employment. The barriers are things around their motivation, their attendance at school, their behaviour, and that's where the project kicks in to address those individualised barriers. So risks are identified and help us with the early identification and tracking. Project intervention is personalised towards the barriers.
Just a little follow-on from that, Chair, if I might. Interested in the bottom of that paragraph. These officers work with the school to identify young people early who may have or likely to develop risk factors. I'm a bit interested to know what sort of training these people have and the sort of things that they're looking for and the sort of things that would be indicative in a child's early development for there to be the skills that are there to identify what is likely to happen quite a long way further down the track, and you know, the sort of things that we need to be aware of that are happening, which give these indications.
I'll start and then I'll hand over to Gareth on this one, but one of the key things for me is that when we advertise any role in that team, what we're looking for in terms of a skill set is that youth support background, so someone who's able to do exactly that, someone who's able to work with that young person, engage with that young person on a level they understand, and probe and find out what the issues are. So we're looking for that as a skill set within the job roles that we put out. But then, and Gareth can talk through this in more detail, there's an assessment toolkit that's used when the officer sits down with that young person in the first instance to help them draw out some of these behavioural characteristics and issues that might lead them to have risk factors going forward. So if you talk about the assessments that are done.
I mean, just briefly before the assessment, obviously we work on the referrals to us. The initial assessments of whether those young people are at risk and what those factors are obviously done by the school. So, for example, if a young person is under the hands of social services, all the assessments have already been done to say that that young person is at risk, if you like. So I don't need my member of staff to be a social worker. I don't need my member of staff to be a teacher. Coincidentally, when we are recruiting, I could give you a list of the staff. A number of the staff are teachers, youth workers, social workers, ex-careers officers. So they come from a range of backgrounds. But a lot of the initial work in terms of the assessment tools, assessments of those if a young person is being referred to statutory provision, statutory services over and above the schools, that's already done before they ever come to us. So I would be very concerned, for example, if my project was doing an assessment before the statutory providers. What we do is have a lot of information at our disposal, the members of staff, to enable us to build a relationship up with the young person, as well as link with the school and say, what do you want to see improved with relation to this particular young person? And then obviously work with the young person to see if we can develop that. Some young people we engage with very easily because we have one-to-one work, and some of the young people don't have significant one-to-one work elsewhere. If we do a group activity, we have at most 8 in a group, because again, some people don't like the classroom base. So I think what we are doing is the initial assessment in terms of that professional support, if you like, is done before we work with them. Then we work them over and above that. In terms of the assessment tools we use a range of different assessment tools. We use things which measure, from a young person's point of view, where they feel they've progressed. So we use a range of sort of progression tools to assess where the young people think they're at in terms of their relationships, in terms of their relationship with the school. So we have, I'm again more than happy to show you some of the files anonymously in relation to what we do in terms of the young people. But again, as I said before, I've always regarded myself and the work we do as additionality. That is, really on a statutory basis, a lot of other agencies are involved. We then try and put some additionality in place to try and help those young people progress, so that by year 11 they don't darken the statutory services again to some degree. Question, I'm sorry.
Well, it does, and thank you for that, because you've clarified what I thought was a bit of a strange thing within that paragraph, because it actually says the project has a team of officers embedded across Torvine's secondary school, suggesting that you were doing the work that might have been expected to have happened from the education, and I was just a little bit confused about that, because it goes on to say these officers work with the school to identify young people. So it would appear that your teams are identifying these people where we would have perhaps expected the school to be feeding to you. So it's clarification just on that paragraph. It's and I think you've clarified it quite well, because that isn't actually what happens.
So the inclusion team, education welfare team, educational psychologist team, we work very closely with those as well. But again, they are supporting individual young people within the school settings or outside of the school. Then they would refer a young person to us if they believe we can have an impact. If they believe we can't have an impact, then bluntly, I don't necessarily want the young person referred to us, if that makes sense. Because some young people's needs are so beyond what we can provide. You know, we have some links with Cronbridge School, for example, but some of the young people within the Cronbridge scenario, it would be wrong of me to say that we're going to have a major impact on those when the statutory services and all the range of support in place maybe is doing that or not doing that, as the case may be.
The purpose of the embedding of the team within the schools is about building the relationships. Yeah. It's not about replacing the function.
Before we move on, I think Veronica would like to come in.
Just briefly, given our experience yesterday of the 2 staff that came along with the 2 young lads, they were absolutely excellent. And it was so clear the relationship they'd built up with 2 boys who in the school setting had probably been incredibly difficult for a teacher to deal with. And it was noticeable, wasn't it? And I think we all felt that they were doing something that was clearly very rewarding for them, but they were giving those youngsters so much. So full credit to them.
There's 2 members of staff, because it's like sometimes you tend to feel that, you're not necessarily supported. And that's another reason why I didn't turn up yesterday. So basically,
on a serious point with it, it's one of the dangers of focusing too much on the numbers, is that from a staff perspective, it's important to get to the numbers, but their driver is those individuals. And you know what? If they end up with a slightly higher number, but they feel that the individuals they have helped, they really have helped, they'll be proud of that, and that's something that we're trying to reward within the team.
John, is there anything you want to add to it or bring into the meeting?
I thought your question was really good about the backgrounds, because we tend to go for youth workers. I was just thinking about the team I've got in Pontypool campus, so you've got an idea. I stole my coordinator from Gareth, so he has a Torvine background. And then I've got someone with a libraries and education background, a lady who's worked in a psychiatric unit and with domestic abuse, someone who's done additional learning needs support, a teacher who's just finished her master's specialising in behavioural management, and a gentleman who came from the steelworks originally and did helping adults progress into education after the steelworks closed. And I think that sums up and we work, they're all embedded in different curriculum areas, but how we work, how my experience is with these young people, and I'm sure you, is sometimes it's almost a personality thing, and who they'll talk to, that's their key worker. I don't care if you should be doing hairdressing and they're in the different curriculum area. If that's who they'll talk to, that's their person. And so that mix is good. And again, we use a screening tool very similar to yours. We use self-referral. We've got the tutor referral system as well. And then the external social services and the feeder schools advising us that we need to pick certain learners up as they come through. But I think a mix. You need that youth work core, but then you want to appeal to the broadest possible range of young people.
Okay, thank you. Veronica, I think you're next.
So we're looking at 2.2.4 at the top of page 23. Have we assessed the success of these support packages? In other words, have you done so? Do you consult with young people to develop support packages that they would actually engage with? How do you know that the packages, such as Changing Gears and Military Prep College, are the types of packages that young people would want? So are you steering them towards those, or is it actually based on the interests that come from the youngsters?
The honest answer is it's a bit of both. There is a lot of provision there, the majority of provision, which is the youngsters identifying with their support worker an area of interest for themselves. But there is some provision that we put on that's usually supported by tutors that's rolled on year after year. And the reason for that is we know that once we get young people engaged with that activity, it delivers the type of outcomes that we're looking to achieve. So something like Changing Gears, I'll take this one rather than Gareth because I think he'd be a bit modest on it. When it started off, it was a very simple bike maintenance project. We didn't know whether it was going to be effective or not. Now it's oversubscribed in terms of the number of young people who want to take part in that project. Now, had we been entirely driven by youth demand coming from the individuals, we may not have set that project up. So it's a fine balance for us between taking a punt, quite frankly, on some new initiatives and being led by what the individuals are looking to achieve. I would like to think we've got that balance about right. We do, as a team, keep it under constant review. So Gareth will testify to this. If I'm constantly on his back to see whether we feel the project is having the outcomes that we want it to have. If it's not, these aren't expensive projects for us to close down. The costs of these are very minimal, and the tutors come in and do things on a sessional basis, so we can quite quickly mobilise in shutting something down and moving on to a different type of provision if it's not working.
Again, just to add to that briefly, it is needs-led driven, to be blunt. I know when a young person comes to us who's unemployed, for example, they want a job in a certain area of work. And so what we do is facilitate that by putting on courses, for example, mentoring them to get them into a job, taking them to interviews, providing them with clothing to attend those interviews, providing them with clothing to work on site, for example. I wouldn't want to provide that for every youngster we work with, but ultimately it depends on the needs of the young person. The other thing, I suppose, is based on the fact that I'm old now, I think, and it's based a little bit on experience. That is, trialling things that we think will engage young people. For example, the bike project, I'd never had any expectations that we would create hundreds of jobs associated with bikes. Although, interestingly, you're probably aware Frog Bikes have set themselves up in Mile. Frog Bikes came after us. They came to see our project when we set up Changing Gears, and they took one of my staff, the Swines. And basically, what do they see? So it's a factory, effectively. Yes. But what do they charge? What do they charge hands? It came from our project. We have the opportunity to place some young people from the bike project. So even though I'd never had any thoughts, really, that this would be a major bike manufacturing area when I set up Changing Gears, it was mainly to engage with young people. It has had spin-offs, which are quite interesting in relation to things like Frog. The idea of setting up things also impacts about maybe things that reflect the local market. So, for example, we looked at things like Dave mentioned, the barista activity, if you like. Now, again, I never thought I would ever set up some sort of support provision for barista work, which is posh coffee, basically, isn't it? You know? And so what we were looking at is, are there opportunities, are there jobs out there in the field that we think we can put something on by bringing in a tutor? We can put them through a course in barista, coffee making, and then I've actually bid for money elsewhere, and we put a coffee making machine in so we can provide the training in-house. They are fairly unique scenarios. 99% of the activities are driven by a youngster who says to us, I want to work in this, and we put something on. But I think some of the young people are just not ready for employment. I'm not being patronising, I promise you, they're just not ready for employment. So we look at, firstly, in many cases, engaging the young people. Because the vast majority want something, they come to us, we put a course on, we support them into employment. They're done and dusted within a couple of weeks in some cases, but some of the young people, and unfortunately it's a fairly biggish minority, they are definitely not ready for that. So we look to see what might tease an interest. We brought a DJ in now, and DJ is old school, that goes back to when I was a kid, you know, but all of a sudden it's technical stuff. It's stuff that the kids are involved in IT, youngsters like IT. And it's just whether that will develop an interest and allow them to engage in something even more positive, if that makes sense.
And that's the key for us, is keeping it under review and keeping that balance between the two, so that if the interests of the next cohort of young people aren't in those areas, we can look at other projects that are.
Next question is 2.2.9. Looked after children, figures have gone up significantly. How closely are you, your team, working with social care on the NEETS programme? So it's open to either of you.
Very closely, to be honest with you. We have one of the Inspire to Work members of staff. Firstly, in terms of the network, the Keeping in Touch network, TIPS, which effectively Total Young People Support Service, which is LAC support really. They sit on that panel. We meet with them every month. We also have a member of staff within the Inspire to Work team who sits within the TIPS office, if you like, to take any referrals directly. We use the Inspire Centre, Stroke Changing Gears, as a drop-in facility for some of the young people who are involved with TIPS. They wanted an opportunity to just make sure they had a hot meal, for example. So they use the youth service, Ashley House, they use our base, they've used the Cross-Achilles Community Ed Centre. We've also got a strong link to organisations like Hales House, for example, which is obviously single homeless accommodation, if that's not a bad way of putting it. But that's a housing association, that's Solace Cymru, I think, Housing Association is Hales House. We have very close links to that. We have a member of staff going in to support those individuals. The issues associated with some of those young people are much broader than employability, though. But obviously what we try and do is put a piece of the jigsaw in place to enable those young people to be much more positively engaged. And even though we are, I suppose, an employability type project, we're more than that in terms of working with agencies and the young people to even get them engaged at all. But it goes back to the Council's question on other agencies, Councillor Nick Jones, because we couldn't operate without the reference to the other agencies. We are not experts in anything other than wanting to support the young people, so we have to work with the other agencies. So the LAC team, we've got quite a significant. It's a shame that the LAC figures are going up. I think those are much more generic than the conversation between ourselves this morning. But any young person that's appropriate, again, go at the bike project. They've asked us in the past, can we give a bike to a young person who needs a bike, and they've got them to go to university. it's going to be in my car and gone within the next 5 minutes. Anything that we can do to support them, even if they're not linked to the project. Obviously, from an ESF point of view, we can only credit, in inverted commas, a young person who has signed up to our project, because that's inevitable. But we do more than that, and if they're not linked to us and we can provide extra support, we will do that.
We'll have to interrogate the data in a little bit more detail, but I don't believe that the increase in the number of LAC children who are identified at risk has translated into an increase in LAC children who are NEET.
No.
So the support that's provided between the point where they're identified and the NEET figures, I think, is working. Like Gareth says, that's not necessarily support that the projects are providing, that's support across the Council through Education and Social Services, but I think the support is there to make sure that the parallels aren't in play.
Hey, do you want to come in?
I just wondered, this is a little bit left field in a way, but I don't know if you have any influence on policy making or anything else, but do you think there is room besides your project for possibly doing more family and parenting work with children, you know, when they hit year 11 and possibly even not hit year 11, hit year 7 and perhaps even earlier on going through the schools, and that's a curriculum area that is missing, which is why LAC figures are going up, and that's impacting, I think, your area too.
Difficult one for us to answer because it falls outside of the sort of scope of the work that we do. What I would say is that Gareth's team do try and engage with parents through the process from sort of June to October, when they're doing door knocking and when they're doing phone calls, to try and get the parents involved in where that child's aspirations lie. So there is work that the team certainly does. Going forward from a specifically NEETs perspective, I would like to see some additional support provided around that in any future project going forward. But it's that crunch time really between June and October where we really need that support to kick in.
Working with parents in school, so the Inspire to Achieve project, for example, all the young people that are referred to us, the parents effectively have to sign a permission form as well. So from a parental point in terms of being referred to Inspire to Achieve, all the parents know, and if I've had a number of people ring me up and say, my youngster's been referred to Inspire to Achieve, what's this all about? And then I'm able to give, that's possibly a communication issue between the school and the parents, but I then try and provide that support. Obviously, all teams like Family First will probably have a much more significant impact, I'd imagine, on parents and family education processes. Parents.
Thank you both. I've introduced you to Councillor Stewart Ashley, Gareth, Dave Leach and Sian from Colleague Gwent. Okay? We hear from Stewart shortly, I assure you. I'm going to ask you now to take a question from Chris too, please.
Right, the Ronnie figure increased significantly. Can you provide further details?
In terms of the actual number who were identified as being at risk, there's the breakdown above of the different risk categories that people fall into. So there's some changes within those individual areas. So free school meals eligibility, for example, it is one of those big areas that has increased. There's such a range of factors considered as part of that Ronnie that it's probably not one individual thing that's changed. It's probably two or three of them that have changed. We can circulate the full details on the Ronnie so that there's more analysis there as to what has changed within those figures. Overall, we are seeing more people coming through who are being identified as at risk this year, but not significantly more than we've seen in previous years. I think the numbers dropped off quite a lot in 2018. We're really in line with the general trends.
Yeah, do you think that's something to do with poverty, looked after children figures rising? What do you think is behind this? Drugs? What do you think?
It's very difficult to say. There's so many features on that at risk, on the risk of NEET indicator. What I would say is a lot of them are linked to the broader sort of deprivation and poverty. So there is a broader link across there. The specifics really would need us to do some more data analysis as to what the individuals are. If you are seeing an increase in looked after children, if you're seeing an increase in free school meals, if you're seeing an increase in, for example, teenage pregnancies, young mums, then the risk of NEAT indicator will show an increase in risk. That's not to say that that's going to translate to an increase in NEAT at the end of the position. That's just to say that some of the factors that we're concerned about are going up. So at the minute, just looking at the data that we've got here, because we pulled out some of the key elements of it, the main rise is within free schools meals eligibility. So that would obviously be linked to poverty levels.
I was going to add to that briefly, if that's okay. In terms of, for example, young mums or teenage pregnancy, again, thankfully, it doesn't translate that if you're a young mum, you become NEAT automatically. But this year we've got 3 young mums, for example, who on November 1st were classified as NEAT. But actually there were 4 young mums, which is 7 people, who progressed successfully in transition. So there's 4 young mums who are either in college, workplace training, or another EAT provision. So again, even though those factors are factors, there are more looked after children, there are more young people on free school meals. As Dave mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean that when the risk factors are increased, then we can reach a level
I think I'm coming up as Councillor Stuart Ashley now.
Sorry about that. Hello. Sorry.
I was just going to add to that. I was just quite interested to look. Our screening for Inspire, we have a category we call health. And the reason we do it is because of the rise we're seeing in mental health issues. And that might be quite you probably find that has been subsumed in a number of these categories, but it's definitely something that would trigger support within the college, mental health and welfare type issues.
Just to pick up on that, actually, because it's a really important point, we've got anecdotal data coming through from the early assessments that are done by the parties that there are potential concerns around that. We haven't identified it as a category because that's not verified data for us, so we couldn't categorically say that's the issue, but anecdotally we're almost certain that we are seeing a rise in it.
Sorry, and you mentioned obviously, Councillor, that things like, for example, is it drugs, things like that. Again, it is anecdotal because you don't say to a young person, are you on drugs? It doesn't normally provide you the answers you want. Well, you might. But I think, again, anecdotally, we are finding, certainly the staff are finding that a number of other factors are impacting on young people that we may not have a measure for, if you like, but they are definitely impacting, and we are seeing it automatically in some young people, unfortunately. But again, in terms of whether that's absolutely an increase or not in Torfaen, I can only work on the basis of what people are telling me, and they are telling me there is more availability of drugs. There are more people taking advantage, in inverted commas, of that. But again, it's if we can impact on something to get them into provision, we will. Those factors probably are beyond our hope of support, if that makes sense.
Anybody else want to come in on that before we move forward?
No, sorry. Thank you. I'm just wondering if you send anyone to the Wednesday morning group? Social services, please. I can't think what.
Member of staff, do you mean? Sorry, Chair? Member of staff, do you mean to go as part of the group? Or?
Yes. That's what I'm thinking of. It's Lyndon's group that meets on a Wednesday morning.
I'm not aware of a member of staff or me attending. I certainly would know if I'm attending.
Just given the sort of problems that you're talking about.
Is this the Community Safety Hub?
Yes.
Sorry,
I just went totally blank. Yeah.
So with the Community Safety Hub, we don't attend directly. We do have an invitation to attend if there's anything particular. We don't attend directly to that, but through the contacts that we have through the Keeping in Touch meetings, and on a much more strategic level through Positive Pathways, which is the overarching group that looks after this, the relevant officers from within Lyndon's teams come along to those meetings as well, so they feed information in. The stronger link for us with the type of people who are involved in those meetings is through the MAPI.
Okay, it's just I think would be an interesting and helpful link.
Briefly to ask you a question. Do you ever find that there's a duplication with all the different groups? That it's overriding how, you know, does it have a detrimental effect on the work that your team are doing?
It's really interesting that you should point that out. Positive Pathways, which, as I say, is the overarching group, has actually been doing a bit of work on this over the last 6 months or so, led by education, to review all of the different problem-solving and case allocation groups that are out there, and to see if we can rationalise it down into a better number of groups. And that work is progressing, and it's much needed. So we're involved in that process. Both Gareth, Lindsay and myself all sit on Positive Pathways. And yeah, we fully support that.
Can you sort of, via Rebecca, give us updates on, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Whether there's duplication on
Right, anybody else want to come in on before we move forward? Question I think perhaps Sean might want to come in on first is the number of people going to Hereford College. What do you think are the main reasons for them travelling out to the borough? Are we not offering the courses they want? Are we not offering the quality of courses?
That number rose sharply this year, didn't it? The main reason for that is that the new campus we're building in Cwmbran, the decision was made to move Year 11 and Year 12 across. And, you know, I think that we will be successful, but there will have been many families and parents out there who have been concerned that that is halfway through an A-level qualification for their children. And I think that's the reason. I am hopeful that we can therefore reverse that in coming years. The college is discussing this, particularly as one of our concerns is once you're putting one sibling on a train to go to Hereford, then their younger brother or sister thinks, oh, you know, well. So we need to avoid a sort of leaching to Hereford, and really I think it's the college has to be the best, doesn't it? We have to provide the best service locally. So the proof is going to be in the pudding.
Thanks, and Sean. Does anybody, Gareth or David, want to have an opinion on that, please?
If I can just add one thing to that, which is that whilst we have seen that number increase, it's not necessarily translating into an increase in the NEETs figures, which is the focus of the work of the team. So whilst that may have a broader impact and is something we're continuing to monitor, we were concerned that it may have an impact, but we're not seeing that yet. So that's quite a positive, I think, going forward, is that the types of people who we'd identified as being at risk aren't necessarily looking like they've been affected by that decision.
I think Councillor Evans was.
Yeah, my concern is with the Sixth College, that would there be an increase with the needs? Because I think, because it's early days yet, we're not 100% sure what could happen.
We're not. So I can tell you what work we are doing. So I started with a gentleman that was then the campus director a couple of years ago working towards this, in fact 2 or 3 years ago. So I sit on a group called the Torfaen Curriculum Planning Group. It's chaired independently by Peter Scott, who's an ex-head teacher within Torvine. I'm sure you know him. And the schools all send representatives to those meetings. Over the last couple of years, we've been trying to build up our relationships with the Torvine schools. I think a lot of this is data-based, so I've gone to all of the Year 11 parents' evenings, options evenings. For the last 2 years, we've done a tranche of assemblies between September and Christmas with Year 11 pupils. We're just about to begin the second tranche. And this year, we've also embedded in the 3 schools that are losing 6th forms, so Crossy, St Albans and Cwmbran, we've embedded a member of staff on a fortnightly basis who's present in the school to answer students' queries. We've made that offer to Westmont and Abersychan, and we have someone on a monthly basis in Westmont. Abersychan, we're still negotiating that. I was going to say something else and I've lost my thread. Cross Keighley, yeah, once a fortnight we have someone in there.
It is kind of worrying for most of us as councillors because we've all been approached by residents who are saying that they've been to an open day and they're a bit disillusioned, and obviously parents want best to achieve for their children, and I personally have had quite a few people coming to me and saying that their children are going to go to Hereford, and obviously they've got brothers and sisters who, I agree with you, will possibly follow. And I think it's something, and I'm glad we are trying to address this, but I think Councillor Ashley wants to
leave that. I mean, my children went to Cross Keys, and some people go to Newport, and it's not just Hereford. We didn't ask that question, but when I think about it, that was the other thing, and we had a whole lot of kids going out of county. Now we've got this brand new centre going in there. We have to make sure the offer is attractive enough for them to want to go there. And it comes down to the spread of courses. Now, have we got the right courses? I mean, languages is one of them, arts is another one. Are we offering the right courses? Because that
Wait a minute, Stuart. Yeah? Just be careful we don't go off tangent.
I'm not going off tangent at all, because the problem is, and it's always been a problem. I'm sorry, I'm quite knowledgeable about this. I'm being very brief, to be honest. The problem was that we were always losing children out of this thing. Now we've got the centre, and we talk about Hereford. I was going to ask the question, which Hereford college, because there were 2 of them. There's a private school, the public school, and the Hereford, I was about to say Tech, but the Hereford for the Education College, and there was also the other one up there. So I used to travel up there quite often. Steve knows why I went up there. So there was hundreds of them going up there, but it was not a few. You travel on the train, you know, in the morning. So just ask that question succinctly, because you obviously got part of your estate with the kids travelling around all over the place, and you don't really want them. You're going to put this new college down here.
Tell me what the question is.
2 things, right? One is travelling around the place. If we're offering a new service down there, we want to use that. 2 is, are we offering the range of subjects?
So I'll do 2 first and quickly, yes?
Yeah.
Just because I'm conscious, Councillor Ashley, you're sort of straying into education sort of remit rather than...
No, I'm not, because that is why the children go up there. When you ask that question, they do.
Yeah, but that's dealing with children that are going on into further education, whereas you're looking at stage children that are not engaged.
A-level subjects is why they go up there, and GCS is why they go up there, right?
But we're not doing that. We're doing not in education.
And I appreciate that.
So can you...
But even on the NEET subjects, they go up there. Seriously.
Do you want to come in very briefly on this, guys? Because I'm conscious that we're treading on ground which we shouldn't be covering.
The children we had in here the other day, right, that we were talking to, wanted to do practical subjects.
As I said, we're conscious it's going off tangent, but if you want to give a brief thing, I would be great.
Gareth offers quite a lot of things that they...
All I would say on this point is that we are not seeing, through this year's figures, a translation in terms of an increase in the number of NEETs from any changes that have been made. So at this point in time, it's not affecting the NEETs.
Again, I don't really want to argue because you said yourself this is an education question, really. In terms of the question from Councillor Evans, I just reiterate Dave's point. That is, this year there have been changes in terms of the provision available, definitely, but has it impacted on the number of neat young people? And again, with the very small aspect of responsibility I have for that, the answer to that question is it doesn't appear that it's had an impact. And I can't comment on anything else, if that makes sense.
Thank you for your comments. As I said, it's placed you in a bit of an awkward position, and I do apologise. Can we take our next question?
The question I was going to ask, I think I'm going to change a little bit because you said you get referrals from year 7 all the way up. First of all, do you get many from year 7?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like the conversation Dave mentioned earlier in relation to if you provide provision, generally speaking, people will want to refer young people to it. So sometimes demand outstrips supply, if that makes sense. And we have to we work very closely with the youth service as well, because they're matched in as part of their time, to try and provide, if you like, a range of different provision and support at each year level, year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10, year 11. Even though on a neat level, if you like, obviously I'm a little bit more concerned with year 11 because that's where they progress out of education. But obviously the earlier we can work with some of these young people, particularly, for example, if these are factors which are relatively straightforward. We've worked with groups of year 7, for example, that are common in what their issues are. They might be, we work with a group of young people from the Gypsy Traveller community, which are linked to Westmont School principally. And again, even though you can't generalise with the individuals, we are getting referrals. I would say the majority of our referrals come from year 9, 10 and 11, the majority of referrals. Because that's, I think, where they think we can have more of an impact to then progress them out. I can definitely supply you with the numbers in terms of the referrals. I'm more than happy to do that. But again, we also have to be aware of the capacity and what we've got to support, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that. Looking at it as a sort of wish list, I know that issues arise in primary and even before primary. I suppose you haven't got the capacity to go that low, really, with your support and help and possible projects.
One of the big constraints on us is that the work and the activities of the project team, which is the bulk of the resource that we've got, are constrained by what they're allowed to do by the funders. So we are tied to the provision that we actually deliver. I'm sure if you ask the project team, they'd love to be able to intervene at an earlier stage. They'd love to be able to continue that support all the way through. But we just don't have the ability to do that with the project constraints.
Obviously, is particularly if they're in year 7, we have the information supplied to us of when they were in year 6. So in terms of the issues affecting those young people as they progress into secondary school, clearly, again, going back to some of the original points, the schools are principally, if not almost exclusively, responsible for that support, along with other parts of education. But if they believe that we can have a positive impact on year 7, then we will try and provide that support depending on what is required of us. But again, it sounds obvious. If I had more resource, I think I would be interested in concept to do a year 6 work. But I think, in fairness, I think there are other people out there. I don't want to be saying that we're the answer to everybody's prayers, because there's a range of other services out there, in fairness, who are provided, who do have the support of the young people at their heart, I think.
Could I just back that up with just saying that I worked as a primary project manager in Caerphilly for 16 years, and then because of the cuts it went, and that worries me right across the board that there's more need now and less provision.
Okay, Edwin, I'm now going to ask Stuart to take up his question, which is question 16, please.
Can you provide us with some background as to why the definition of neat is being reviewed and what is likely to be replaced with? Because we're all very used to it, I suspect. The definition of neat and what is it going to be replaced with, Dave? On 28.
If I can just briefly answer that, one of the things that obviously the Youth Engagement and Progression Framework, which is like this Welsh-driven policy, if you like, that we've been part of, probably over the last 6 years now, the definition of NEET is relatively fixed. By that I mean the definition of risk of NEET, good question earlier about the wrongly, and what we use is the definition of the factors at risk. One of the questions which I can't remember whether they came from Councillor Jones in relation to the unknowns. One of the things I've been concerned about, and that question was answered earlier, or asked earlier, in relation to, if NEET is this, why aren't you including unknowns when effectively you don't know whether they're NEET or not? And what's currently happening, I think in Welsh Government at the moment, there's a range of different policy documents driven probably partially because of where European funding may or may not be going, where they're looking at whether other people take some more responsibility for this and not just local authorities. In other words, whether Careers Wales have much more of a part to play. All the contracts for work-based learning are up for grabs and are changing at the moment. So again, there's a number of sort of transitory things occurring at the moment. And I think where we're at is, in terms of the definition of NEET, I don't think that's going to necessarily change, but on a statistical level, if you're looking at whether we are first on the list or 22nd on the list, if unknowns, this is a personal opinion, if unknowns not included in that, then you're not getting a proper reflection, I think, in an area of whether a young person is NEET or not. And even though I am bothered by tables, like I'm sure you are, I'm only bothered by tables if I think they're fair. And if I think the table is unfair, and again I'm biased, I know, I would certainly be up in arms. So I always, every year, produce my own table, which takes into account unknowns as well as NEETs, to be honest. So.
The other element of that, very briefly, is consideration as to whether there should be a breakdown between people who aren't ready to enter the world of work or who are unable to enter the world of work, which currently fall under the NEET category. There is certainly for those who are unable, potentially because of limiting health conditions, to enter the world of work, there is very little that the project teams can do to support that. So whilst the overall definition may not change, that segregation underneath that, so there's better understanding of the categories, is important.
Is there anything you want to come in on, Sharon? I know Councillor Ashley wants to come in.
I can see there's a problem with the term because you're doing everything, as we've just discussed, from post-primary school kids, young people, right through to further education, and we, as we were discussing the other day, from people that are dropping out of university. So you've actually got to consider, and young mothers and parents. So it's a catch-all phrase for a hell of a lot of different things. Can you comment on that?
Well, you've given the accurate definition of it. It is a catch-all for a range of different things. Yeah. And in terms of our ability, the thing is, what I look at is the ability to impact on it. Yeah. Have I got the ability within the work that I do or partnership work in to impact on it? And I think in many cases we do. As Dave mentioned, this unable to progress into education, employment and training, or not ready. Not ready is a little less of a physical or mental health issue, isn't it? Not ready is they're not ready at this time. Unable to means they literally cannot progress. So what impact can I have, can my staff have, can my projects and activity have on those factors? Young mums, for example, we can do as much work, we support Young Mum Group, but I'm not involved, thankfully, in relation to getting them becoming a young mum in the first place. So the issue is, what can we impact on them? How can we support them? And from a young mum's point of view, just to use that example, can we support the young mums potentially retrain to work part-time, to look at things where they will potentially become EAT, if that makes sense, even though some of those factors are difficult to impact on.
The important thing for us is that regardless of what the definition is, as you'll see from some of the tables we've been presenting, we monitor that data anyway. So we look at that segregation, we look at what those risk factors and issues and barriers are, and we track that throughout. So that's what's important to us rather than what the broad definition ends up being.
Veronica?
Thank you. Looking at the top of page 29, 321, and it's it's the sentence in general, the schools were highly effective at identifying which young people were most at risk, currently identifying 81% of those who ended up as NEET. And the question is, what happened to that 19%?
The early identification process is a very, very difficult process to do. So when we say they correctly identified, that meant that they got it spot on from an early stage, that they knew that that person was going to become NEET. So it's not to say that the 19% disappeared or became NEET because the school hadn't tracked them. It's just to say that when they undertook that process of very early identification, they correctly saw the risk factors at that point in time.
So can I just add to that? Yes. And you're also talking in some cases about very, very small numbers.
Yeah.
And I think early identification is crucial, but we'll also find that some of the NEET young people that we find on November the 1st, for example, were never ever indicated as being at risk, for example, and they've just not progressed successfully, or they may have gone into provision and dropped out of provision. And you do tend to find there's a little bit of that flow occasionally with some young people, because they're leaving a place where they were, protected, they had a supportive environment in vast majority of cases, and they've gone into the real world and they've struggled a wee bit, to be honest.
Just to add to that, I think the key to that is about data sharing and transition. So working more closely with Torvine schools has been really useful for me, and they are starting to share increasing amounts of data. And one of the things I would like us to move towards in Torvine is and I'm looking at the programming for this now, so that we know when certain Year 11 pupils have applied to us. Because one of the gaps, some of those 19%, the things I want to know is, did Nan die in June? There's, that's,
yeah.
So as you said, they've gone through, all the way through, not identified on Ronnie anywhere. Nan died in June, it's all gone wrong. So I think as we get better at data sharing within Torvine, and I think we are moving in the right direction, a lot of that's down to Lindsay behind me, hopefully we'll get better at that 81%.
Right, Nick, next question, please.
Yeah, just following on a little bit from that next paragraph, the 3.2.2. Again about processes, there's a line in there, most schools have clear lines of responsibility for destination process. Really just to comments on, have we actually identified these schools who are not as effective in this area, and how are we working with these schools to make improvements?
So a big part of one of the roles within the team is about liaising with the schools, with an identified person in the schools. One of the challenges that we face, of course, is if that identified person changes, as has happened a lot over the last sort of couple of years, it becomes difficult then to build up that rapport and that relationship with a new person. So we do get there, but we are, and I fully admit this, at the mercy of personnel changes in terms of building those relationships. In terms of which individual schools we have strong relationships with now and which ones we don't, I couldn't say that at the minute without going back and looking at the data. What I would say is that I do believe it's the vast majority of them that we now have a very strong working relationship with.
Just to add to that, I think actually we have a strong relationship with all of the 6 secondary schools. It's just based on, they're all slightly different. They all have different processes. They have different people responsible for different things. Some you would liaise directly with the head of Year 11. Some you might have somebody who's specifically dealing with progression post Year 11. And obviously the relationship with Careers Wales is also crucial in this environment. So it's a sort of a tripartite conversation really between Careers Wales, the schools, and ourselves, if you like, in terms of Inspire, to make sure that as much as possible preparation work is done prior to a young person leaving school. 100% effective, to be honest, but it is what I think it should be at the moment.
I think,
So are we suggesting that it is processes within schools in not having a responsible body for communicating with yourselves that's letting this down? I'm not quite sure what the suggestion here is. There's a suggestion here that something isn't working quite right in certain schools. So
That's not the intention of the line. The intention was to say the opposite, that actually the processes are working effectively, but they are different in different schools, so it won't always be the same person in each school, and that at the minute is working. So we wouldn't want to be suggesting that there should be a certain role within the school, a certain individual within each school that has to do this. If schools are choosing to identify different individuals, that's working well for us. The key is that we know who those individuals are and can build up a relationship and a rapport with them.
Do you want to briefly?
20 years ago, I think it's that long ago, I started as a community worker in Pontypool, and I remember well, I won't say the community, somebody actually having to go round and count the needs in a certain community. Now, what you're saying now, you've got a good process, and I think that's really quite an achievement. You've got the data, and you've got the schools doing it, not community workers, not you lot doing it, and it seems to me we've got a system that's working, and it's important the schools have a role identified. It doesn't have to be a named individual, and it's important that we establish that fact. I'm just thinking about that. 20 years ago, we had to go and count them. Somebody was sent out there to do it, and that's quite frightening when you think about it. And we progressed quite well by the sound of it. I'll just make that point, Chair. Yeah.
The key for us here is that we keep that up, to be honest, and that we make sure that we're still getting all of the information that we need. We don't want to be complacent. Yes, it is working well. We need to make sure it continues to work well.
Steve, would you like to give me the next question?
Yeah, paragraph 3.33. Do we only work with businesses in Torwalling, or do we look across neighbouring borders? But the other aspect of it is, what are we doing with people with disabilities as well, in training and everything else?
In terms of entering employment, apologies. In terms of entering employment, that's the main question, in terms of working with employers outside of the area. Okay. Again, it partly is based on the work we do with individual young people. So, for example, at post-16 level, when we are looking at employment opportunities that we might be able to support a young person into, then we don't think about the locality, to be blunt. The young person probably looks at the locality, because the vast majority of young people want a job locally, and again, it's common sense, but it is based on fact that they want a job locally. They want to reduce the number of barriers and issues they have to get into employment. Some of the jobs that are out there are not in the local area, and they're well outside of this patch. So obviously, in terms of both supporting young people to access, for example, training that's not offered in this area, we've put people on, and we've physically taken them to training outside of the area. In terms of employment, in terms of supporting a young person into employment elsewhere, obviously we can help support that process. We will liaise with employers. We will take young people to interviews if need be. After that, really it's up to a young person whether, or anybody really, as to their ongoing link to that employer and the issues affected by transport issues, about money going back and forth. But in terms of our support for a young person to get into employment, that's not driven by locality specifically, but unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, it is definitely something that comes in the main, not all. Some young people are more than happy to go elsewhere, and by doing, for example, security training, for example, that those jobs opportunities might be all over the world effectively, and some young people are more than happy to look at those things. Our job is to facilitate their progression towards that, if that makes sense.
What I would say is I think it's one of the big opportunities going forward from the amalgamation of the economic development teams and the skills teams into one service area, that we now have data on where new regional employment opportunities are going to come from. So all of the points that Gareth made there aside around transport links and everything else, for those who are willing to address those, we should now be able to form a better connection. We've not done that as strongly as I would like in the past, and that's an opportunity for us now going forward.
To answer your question, the second part of the question in relation to disability, that's a very difficult one, to be honest, for me to answer specifically. Only because we work with young people who refer to us or self-refer. And I would say, once we do record if you like, the category of young person, if that is a factor. In terms of the disability issues, we'll try and support any barriers that we can support, but ultimately it's whether we can have a real impact on a young person if they are severely disabled. And I would say probably the projects have not been set up to do that. I'm being honest with you now, truly honest. I don't think the project has been set up with that huge supportive range of other needs that can be covered. The one thing we do though, which is I think partly answering your question, we work with a range of other projects. For example, there is a project which is supported by Mind, and it's a lottery funded project which works directly to get young people with autism into employment. Now again, that's a very specific piece of work. It's a Welsh project, and there's a company in North Wales and there's a company in South Wales. So if a young person is referred to us from, say, Job Centre Plus with a very specific learning need, which is, say, autism, if we feel that we can't be supportive of what they want, we would work very closely with other agencies, like, for example, this agency which is linked to a company called Elite, based in Treforest, where they would have targets to work with so many young people in Torfaen. But to answer your question about disability as a whole, we don't specify that we won't work with a young person with disability. We'll try and work with whoever presents themselves to us, but it's a question of whether we can have a major impact. If we can, we will.
The reason I raised the question, because the Crownsbridge, school as well, and it probably, issues with people, need to perhaps access this service,
Again, to answer your question briefly, again, in terms of the young people we work with in school, we would definitely work with young people in school as part of Inspire to Achieve, who are statemented, who have School Plus, so there's a range of different links to different definitions, if you like. We don't work directly with a member of staff in Crownbridge, because actually Crownbridge is very good at organising a planning progression routes for the young people, because they have to be. Because there's almost an automatic link in some cases to adult social services. There's a natural pathway. It sounds awful, but you know what I'm trying to say. There is. And I don't want to interfere with that support. But we will work with any young person who's referred to us. And if Job Centre Plus, for example, feel a young person could benefit from being linked to us, and or Communities for Work, which is the other sister project, we would definitely try and work with them.
Anybody else briefly want to come in before we go on to our next question?
I just said there, because obviously part of my experience with autism, but it's not just autism, there's people with mental illness. That's very interesting what you've just said, because a tailored approach and a mentored approach is something we discussed the other day. People with autism, people with mental illness, possibly other things, that would be something if you could develop projects there, because they're right down the bottom of the pile, and actually getting some hope for them, I think, is something you could do. Them, people with those problems, I should say that more directly, is something that really, I think, is the next stage on. And it's just something, the percentages of people getting, certainly with autism, because I've obviously got considerable personal experience with it, got 4 people in the household with it. I'm only saying that because that's something, if we're going to achieve anything at all, is that they're the big part of what you've got in this position.
I think Sean wants to come in, and then Veronica.
Yeah, just to briefly come in and to make you aware, as part of the group that manages the new build in Cwmbran, there is an ALN transition group, a steering group. I'm going to it tomorrow, chaired by Richard Thilbeck, who's hearing impaired, and the specific focus of that group that meets about once half term and has been for a year is to ensure, and we use ALN in the broadest possible, that's physical and learning difficulties, that transition at least into the college is supported. So hopefully that fits.
That sounds really good.
Yeah.
Okay, Veronica, do you want?
Just briefly, I think under well-being, many employers nationally are now looking at mental health issues and autism and where they can support staff.
briefly, do you think there is a gap in the market? Because years ago we used to have like the Remploy, which was in Tree Forest. Do you think that was something that we should be aiming to be able to provide with people with disabilities?
I'd love to see more support, certainly, particularly for neat young people or people at risk of becoming neat who have disabilities. As you can see from the data, one of the categories that we assess is people who have health conditions. And as part of that, that is one of the categories that we find the most difficult to avoid becoming neat because of the nature of the support projects that we offer and because they can't address those health conditions. That's not their skill set. So, yes, I would like to see more support if it were available.
I think many years ago, I don't know if I'm correct, that companies were encouraged with financial help to take on people with disabilities, diabetes and things like that. And I think, do you remember where my father worked, there was a gentleman who had diabetes, and the companies were encouraged. Obviously, they were given a little bit more financial help from local government, but it is something that we should be looking into.
Just to try and answer that question on your previous question directly. In relation to young people that are referred to us, whatever the factors are, even though we've got European targets linked to, for example, getting so many young people into employment, so many to gain a qualification, thankfully 90% of those will progress in the way that I'm describing. There will be other young people, depending on what issues they have, where it might take us an awful lot longer to have a significant impact on them. But going back to Councillor Jones's question earlier in relation to the type of staff that we employ, for example, one thing I don't want to be is all things to all people, because there'd be a real danger that we would be trying to provide support for people that really we're not trained or able to support. I think the important thing for me is there are processes in place that if we do have a young person referred to us, both in school but probably more likely post-16, that we believe is best served with another project, that we don't give up on that young person, but we try and find an option, an alternative for them. It won't go back to morals here a wee bit. I would find that morally indefensible, that I would just say, no, sorry, we can't work with you. The issue is making sure they are progressed onto something that is appropriate.
The important thing for me, I think, is that as part of any review that we'll be doing linked to the end of EU funding for these, we need to go back to the data and we need to understand what proportion of at-risk young people suffer from health conditions, how many of those aren't receiving the support, like Gareth says, through the projects that exist, to identify whether there is a gap in the market, and then assess whether we are the right placed organisation to fill that gap.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think the ALN Act will come into power next year, and I think from an education progression point of view, that is going to empower people with disabilities and strengthen their case to progress within education. So.
John, I just really quickly want to go. One of the problems I've got, and I'm not the only one with it, is I've got 3 young people who will not go out, autism and mental health issues together. I think I've talked to you about it before. I think it's a much bigger problem than just us, because I've talked to other parent carers about it. Your difficulty is, I think you're very clear about, and I like that, is that you're not all things to all people. And the problem is the health providers have got the same problems as well. They could be employed, and you're about employment and some education. There needs to be a coming together for this kind of project you're talking about, finding some sort of employment where they can either do it at home or do it in a place where they feel sanctuary. And I use that word advisory. But there need to be some understanding of the problems, mental health and autism and those conditions. And I think there's a very worthwhile bit of work needs doing there. Because they will not go to the projects you've got. They need to have projects that work with them, and employers are willing to take them on.
I'm sure, and we're grateful for your comments. I'm sure they will be taken on board by Gareth and David. Okay, right, we're getting near to the end of our questioning, so can I call upon Faye?
just wondering, do we work with the businesses that we place people into to make them understand some of the difficulties with perhaps behaviour and other things that the young people are going to be possibly exhibiting? I'm thinking of this because I'm thinking of the old bridge courses that I once worked on, where sometimes some employers were identified and then were not equipped really to help those young people or keep them on their books.
It's something that we need to be doing more of, to be honest. And again, it ties back to relationships. And some of the strongest relationships we have with our businesses and the owners of those businesses, where they can start implementing real change and understanding, comes from our business support teams. Now that the business support teams are more closely aligned to the needs teams, yes, we can start to do that. Because I think we need to be instilling that attitude at a management level within those businesses, whereas the ITW workers tend to be placing just with the recruiting officer. So we need to be going in at a management level and working with those businesses to understand the challenges that they may face, but the benefits that they will get. And that's the key for us, is that a lot of businesses don't understand this part of the world, and we need to work closely with them to make sure that they do.
Ultimately, obviously, in terms of the links to employers that we have with Inspire to Work, we would do an element of preparation work, and obviously we prepare in advance some of the employers in relation to the type of young people they were likely to get. But ultimately, it's about the young person impressing the employer to then say, yes, we'll take them on and take a chance. We're also finding that work-based training providers, for example, because there's a number of those in this authority, they also have a direct link to employers. They definitely have more of a stronger link in terms of wanting to make sure that there's success in relation to having young people on placement. From an Inspire to Work point of view, if we place a young person into employment, I don't want that young person to drop out, to be honest. It's not going to be a positive impact on my targets. If I'm just basing it on targets alone, my staff don't want kids to drop out of employment. So if we get them into employment, we want to make sure they're supported in employment. But again, there are some young people who will dip their toes in and then dip their toes out, to be honest.
Stuart, if you want to come in for question 21, please.
This is sort of something we've been talking about, but what further work could be undertaken to increase multi-agency working? To Gareth, you know this one well, I think.
I think from my point of view, the work is already underway, which is the work that Positive Pathways are doing now to review all of the multi-agency arrangements that we have. So there is more to do. What I would like to see is new partners being introduced into the mix. Certainly some of the areas we've covered today around accessibility is some of the provision we have from people with disabilities. Absolutely, there may be other partners who we can introduce into the multi-agency frameworks that we have around that, but that review is already taking place. So I think we're definitely on the right lines there. And I think it's important to echo what Sian said earlier, that the data sharing and the multi-agency work has come such a long way over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, that we're certainly in the right direction there.
Obviously, I've sat in meetings with Gareth over the last 50 years. I'm CCYP and the communities first. Are we missing anything?
In relation to multi-agency working?
Yeah. Are we? Because you do utilise a lot of it, and I just wondered where we're missing.
I think as Dave was saying, there's a lot of review of things in relation to multi-agency working. Some are because Welsh Government are changing policies. There's various new legislation coming out now having an impact on where careers sit, the work that they do, the funding for work-based training. All of those factors won't detract from the need to have multi-agency working. I hate to think that it's only based on relationships with people, but unfortunately in many cases people's relationships with other people are quite crucial in relation to making sure that your multi-agency working works, which is why Dave mentioned Positive Pathways reflecting on this, to look at what process, regardless of people, what process needs to be revised, revamped, put in place to make sure that going forward it continues. And I, obviously again I'm biased, I believe we've had good multi-agency working up until now, specifically in relation to NEET, because that's obviously what we're discussing. But that needs to be constantly monitored because people do change. People leave roles, people leave jobs, structures change. I don't think we're missing any agency, to be honest. So for the two you mentioned, for example, we have very strong links with those Communities First, which obviously is funded primarily through Welsh Government. The Communities for Work team is ESF funded. We like sisters, brothers and sisters, because we have to be. We have to work closely with them. CCYP, I used to work in CCYP a long time ago, and that's a major provider of youth work alongside the statutory agencies, and they would impact on a range of different young people. So they would have an impact one way or other. CCYP sit on the KIT group. So I can't think of anybody. I'm sure you probably got it written on the back of another sheet somewhere saying an agency we're not working with. I don't think we do have, but we need to review it this year and make sure that for the next 3 years it works. I don't want those neat figures going up. I don't want the unknown figures to go up. And I don't want things that might happen to impact on those. So I think if we review the process about to continue with the positive working, then hopefully over the next 3 years the figures will remain low.
We come to our final two questions now, and I'm going to ask Veronica to come in, please.
Thank you. I'm looking at the top of page 30 at 3.36, so the trends. And it talks about Year 11 destinations data is held and managed by Careers Wales, but there's no similar survey for updating data for years 12 and 13. And the question is, and it's really seeking clarification, why not, if the definition of NEETs covers young people up to the age of 25?
It's a really good question. We would love to be able to have a consistent database that goes all the way up to the age of 25. My suspicion is that once young people, and it is only a suspicion, that once young people leave statutory education, it becomes much more difficult to track them because the schools have such good processes in place for knowing what students are enrolled. They're able to feed that data in through the information sharing arrangements into Careers Wales. So there's a very comprehensive database at that point. Sixth form becomes more difficult, particularly because we're not just then looking at school sixth forms. We're looking at FE, we're looking at work-based learning, we're looking at employment, and beyond 19 it becomes more difficult again. It becomes DWP data then, exactly, Department of Work and Pensions data, and that's why for us at that age group, that's the importance of those projects engaging with the young peoples, and as having the referral networks out there. So all of the projects that we have cross-refer. If somebody approaches Communities for Work and Communities for Work can't support them, they will refer into I2W. If someone approaches Bridges for Work, one of our adult employability programmes, and they can't support, they will refer into I2W. So we try and cast as wide a net as possible to make sure that we're still picking them up. But it would be fantastic if there was a system that could capture up to the age of 25 all young people.
This is one of the things that when the Youth Engagement Progression Framework was set up, and we were having meetings in Torfaen, reflecting probably meetings in the other 21 local authorities, this process of monitoring data up to 19 using Careers Wales data was all well and good, and that was great. Because it was, yes, you have to continue to review it, yes, you have to make sure that you change, they call it tier system effectively, but if somebody goes into employment, you change the tier so that they're not seen as unemployed. You need to make sure that data is updated, but 19 plus, it was like a black hole. The conversation we were having with DWP, the whole information sharing process, and the ability to have conversations about not just data, but talking about individuals. Because within the Keeping in Touch group, for example, we talk about individual young people. It's not a theoretical exercise. We talk about Johnny who was unemployed, and then try and put in place a process to support Johnny, target Johnny, whatever. Post-19, as Dave mentioned, we have to work on the referral system by making sure that, for example, if they're unemployed, the DWP, that's why we've got a member of staff who links to the job centres. Bridges into Work have members of staff who link to the job centres. Committees for Work have members of staff who link to the job centre, as well as other agencies post-19, just to make sure that if the young people are out there, they're unemployed and are eligible, they are referred to the various projects. Because otherwise, bluntly, we would know about them.
We can on to question by Chris Tuno, which is related to paragraph 4.1.
Has work commenced on preparing this business case? Scrutiny should be cited on this business case once prepared.
Work hasn't commenced yet on preparing the business case. We're at the stage of collating the data that we have on the cost of the service provision. We'll shortly be going into, now that we've got the unverified data, going into a more thorough assessment of what's worked, what hasn't worked. That'll all be internal. We're not talking about an external evaluation here, but an internal assessment of what we feel has worked, where we feel the gaps are. And once we pull that business case together, it will go through all of the proper processes it needs to go through.
Our last question, which was by Councillor, I think has already been answered with regard to causes. So that brings the end of our question. I'm just going to ask the three of you if you'd like to give us an update on what you see developing further, or how you would like to see the work that you do developing.
For me, from the college, obviously it's all about this new campus in Cwmbran and making sure that it's working effectively, and it is really, for me, all about information sharing. We've made terrific progress with the schools in Torfaen. I'm really pleased, and I have personal relationships with someone in all of the schools. As you said, it's a different person in all of the schools, but it's someone. And they have been very supportive in helping us move this project forwards. We have the curriculum planning group which meets regularly and is moving things forwards. The schools are they all signed up to data sharing protocol? I think so. And that is providing us with names. For me, the next step to avoid for needs prevention is that sort of ALM plus type data, the Ronnie data, the little nuances of individual learners which might prevent them coming into tertiary education. And I think progress is being made on that. There's a pilot research case study going on here led by Dr. Julie Casey, who's looking at learners with additional learning needs and how they transition. But as a wider part of that, we're looking at the whole cohort of data that comes up from schools. And I do pastoral and additional learning needs support. And as I said, for me, it is knowing, did Nan die? Is there substance misuse within the household? Have there been reports? Very, very wide data. Very difficult to share, very personalised data. But the more information you've got for a 16-year-old as they step through the doorway to college, the more likely you are to retain them. That's just a fact. So for me, that's where we go next.
For me, I think it's important that we remember what it is that we're trying to achieve, which is outcomes for those individual young people. And it's critical for me that there is still a provision available to support those young people. And what I'd say is to take you back to 2.1.1 in the report and the list of the key elements in terms of effective support that are in the youth engagement and progression framework. Identifying young people most at risk of disengagement. Yes, we've got good systems and processes in place, I believe, for doing that. There are always areas to improve, but I think on the whole that's strong. Brokerage and coordination of support, yes, I think that's strong. Tracking and transition, we do need to be doing more post-19, certainly with the gaps around database provision, and we do need to be doing more to make sure that people are tied into employers, so that we're not just placing with employers and then losing that person, we're actually tracking that person more strongly. And then provision, making sure that we still have provision. And that's the key for me, is if you look at all of those elements of the youth engagement and progression framework, where I think we've been strong is having teams there who can help with each element of that. They can help identify, they can help track, and they can help provide that tailored one-to-one support that you would have seen when you spoke to the young people yesterday. So for me, when we're looking at a business case for what the future of needs provision may be, those are the key areas that I think we'd be looking to focus on to make sure that we're not watering down our outcomes and what we're trying to achieve in those areas.
It's difficult to add to what Dave said, really. Obviously, from a very biased, bigoted point of view, I'm ESF funded, and my team is ESF funded, so clearly from that point of view, when the ESF funding, forget about me personally, just think of the people, I guess. If the work is effective, then whoever does the work, I'd want in one way, shape or form that to be continued. It doesn't necessarily have to be with me, it doesn't necessarily have to be with my team. But the team are very experienced now in terms of supporting individual young people. I'd like to think, obviously myself and Dave will look at, what other opportunities there might be going forward. Post 2022, is there any underspend within Welsh Government budget? Who knows? The issue, I guess, for this is, unfortunately, it is all externally funded, which is obviously a major implication for yourself as councillors in terms of whether and what resource might, and what might happen if this disappears or this doesn't disappear. Ultimately, I'm only interested in the young people, to be honest with you. So, whoever provides that opportunity to support them, be it within the school scenario, or statutory services, or from a project like my own, I don't mind as long as they support it.
Thank you on behalf of the committee. You've been really patient and you've given up a lot of your valuable time because you've been very busy. We're very, very grateful for your in-depth answers and how passionate you are. It's come over really, really well how passionate you are. And Gareth, can you pass on behalf of all of us, our really congratulations to your team who've inspired to work and inspired to achieve. They were really, really promoted a very, very good relationship that they have with these young people that we saw. And I think that they're all to be commended on the work that they do. And I hope these two young people that we spoke to go on to achieve greater things. I don't know if anybody else would like to endorse anything or make a comment.
Well, I will just reiterate what Janet said. I mean, these young people are an inspiration, and hopefully they take it on and bring other people on board, which I did say to them yesterday. Anything's achievable, whatever your situation. And I think for them to be given a chance and support, I think it's great. And I think this service is tremendous.
All I want to do is to thank you for all the hard work and hope that we can continue supporting you in everything we do. Okay? Yes. Do you need to have a break or anything for 2 minutes? Carry on. Some of you have another meeting. We really need to address the matter in hand. So we need to consider the performance on needs, the effectiveness of the delivery model, the partnership arrangements, the risks and mitigations associated with sustaining performance at current level, giving future uncertainty over funding and provision, and also provide recommendation to the Executive Member for Economy Skills on an area for greater focus. So I'm going to hand us back to Rebecca now.
Thank you, Chair. So just a couple of points that I picked up throughout your discussions. It's up to members whether you agree to these as recommendations. Obviously, they've discussed the business case that they will be planning in terms of the risk of funding ceasing in 2022. So obviously I'm assuming as a committee you would want that to come back once it's prepared in its first format for you to go through. Secondly, a greater focus on tracking for 16 to 25-year-olds. He mentioned they go on to working skills for employment, etc., but he did say that that could be an area for greater focus.
Particularly post-19.
Post-19,
Yeah.
Are we going to put in about perhaps keeping a neat figure, an acceptable level, or?
Yeah, how can you determine that?
No. The reason I was picking up on Gareth's comment that he didn't want the neat figures to be go shooting up, with uncertainties.
Question from David that he was really keen on the data and the data tracking and the schools. That's what I was on about. That is such an improvement to 20 years ago where I made that anecdotal thing about people going out and finding them. We're not doing that anymore. It's really important that the whole system works.
Yeah, you're saying by the better tracking of the over 90s, it would help them keep a better focus on the neat figures. Sorry, yeah.
Sure that schools and everybody buys into that.
They do.
Well, yeah, but I like the fact it's a role.
I also picked up from college, how they are going to address everything. So obviously she's buying into it, but would it be worth us asking for for updates or in a 12-month time to see how progression has come along on that?
Could we put a recommendation in standardising the role in school so that it had the name in each school, because they did make the point on several occasions that there were many different ways of accessing the school and different people in different roles who they accessed, and I think that will help the schools to hit the neat figures a lot better if they have one person with one name, same in each school.
Can it be a reporting requirement? I got the thing from Dave that it shouldn't be a named person, it should be a reporting requirement, because if you have a name that's off, you then lose it. What he was driving us towards was actually being a reporting requirement. It's a different thing.
What I was saying was it's not going to be Mr. Jones every time you go in, but it's going to be so and so their title.
That's
obviously you're not expecting an additional member of staff, someone who's already in the role, but that role is identified within the role.
I think one of the points that he did make quite clearly, though, is he didn't want it to be too rigid, because otherwise it would be a case of if that person is missing, then nobody does it. I think that's what the difficulty is.
You've got your own person who could take that on one day. They got the figures there.
But I think the point that it needs to be reported as that there's a necessity to report this. Then it's
national.
I think because
and it becomes a role of the school then to actually provide this information. It doesn't matter who it is or what the job title is. That he's made it quite clear that to get what they need, they get many different things from many different people, and it is it's the school's responsibility to report to these people. And I think the recommendation should be that the schools report to these people.
Can I just say, having worked in the schools on this area, I feel that sometimes people are so busy within schools, it's important if somebody knows there is that role that has to be done. I'm not saying you can't gather extra information from extra people, but people are so busy in schools at the moment that I think to name the role, somebody who has that as part of their remit will make a huge difference. I think it's little things like that.
I fully anticipate that they will come back and say that there is somebody with that role, but I will note that down.
It's already there.
Essentially onto the list of responsibilities of a person. For example, the head teacher, the deputy head. It's part of their.
It's a job spec remit that's needed.
I also had about a greater focus being placed on working with businesses around training them and understanding
what the needs of people.
Rather than that, to keep updated on the training, that the young people want that training. There's no point giving them bikes, and in 10 years' time they want something else. So
I got very strongly from Gareth that he was specifically what that service was about was actually getting people into employment, not doing the welfare bit, although he's very good at that. Well, that's the aspect. If it's about his life skills and employment, not welfare.
I think sorry, Faye, I just saw your pen come up. The meeting that we had yesterday reinforced that. Yeah. That it was actually a very holistic approach to the youngsters, and that was where the success was. I would like to.
That might be very interesting, but it's very specific. On a more general point, I think that the recommendation needs to be in there that they reach out to employers from the point of view of finding out the skills that employers need. Because if we're going to be training these people to be employable, then the employers need to have an input into that. I know that's sort of perhaps going into career service a little bit more, but it's
skills that people have might not suit the particular thing. The skills that what these youngsters want to do. I mean, in engineering, if you have a learning difficulty, you don't know the complications that would involve without, health and safety. If they don't use equipment properly, the effect it could have on other employers. I'm very, very cautious about on that, because I think that people with disabilities really should, be focused as well. But it's getting the employers on board who are willing to take them and understanding greater the difficulties, the needs of these young people.
Going back to an earlier point that I tried to come in, I do think that's okay. I do think that they have a budget. The guy who was there, sorry, was it Stuart? What's his name? Dave. Dave. I do think that Dave probably has a budget to buy somebody boots or whatever if they haven't got them, if they need to go to an employer. And that is really important because you need it there and then, or else they'll miss that opportunity of getting into that business. I'm sure he must have that.
Sorry, one of the points that came out at the end when they were summing up was their close links, which have started now with the business support teams, and that alignment and going out into the business community. Yes, absolutely.
It needs to be built on.
It needs to be reinforced.
And we're not talking just about youngsters with disabilities. I think you've got to. Yes. Yeah.
With all this, they brought this up themselves. They've got to be careful they're not duplicating stuff.
Yes.
So this is where they need to analyse what they're actually doing to make sure they aren't duplicating it.
Yeah, what he did very specifically is he mentioned the positive pathway, that they're going to be doing a review into groups and duplication. So I think if we can have a report back on the outcome of that, yeah.
Can I just point out that positive pathways, that will report, I think, more generally to the PSB, because it's not just looking at the work on NEETs, it's authority-wide, looking at all multi-agency working. So.
So are we going to make a recommendation about the business support people working more closely with this team?
Yeah.
Because he was hoping to build on that, wasn't he?
Yes.
The business support team now comes, because employability and skills has been brought together, they all work together now, so that's what you were saying. Now they're all under that umbrella. They're all part of the same team now. So
Do we have a target on looking at how they're doing now they're a new team coming together, or new teams, or new way of working?
thinking within your scope of what you're looking at as a scrutiny committee, obviously you've got a number of important items, so whether you want to look at a service area and how it's performing might not be a priority. If there are issues, it could be brought to visioning that you look next year, perhaps the service isn't working, but unless there's something that arises as an issue, it's obviously performing fairly well at the moment.
I was just going to say, don't forget, and it came up right at the beginning with our questions, and we actually then deleted it. They've now got the engagement and progression coordinator, and that links in with the business teams and so on.
Obviously, I would agree.
If they're collaborating with within our own business unit and everything, could we then ask them what this statistical wise, you know?
I'll say the one thing about the collaboration tracking, that's a good point you brought up there. But the other thing I did want to say, because I did ask it about, within this NEATS thing, there are various specific things that could be tracked as well. I asked the thing about isolated young people, mental health, autism, etc., etc. There are potentially specific projects that could be tracked, not diverting from what Gareth said. They are potential new projects that obviously are specialist bits of work. So I'd like that reflected in our discussion. I'm not, so, you know, issues that come up that I raised, that certainly I think other people did as well, that there are obviously young people that have got, that the young people here had problems with criminality and things like that. Drugs might be one, not just autism. So it's only specific issues that come up within the needs.
We've all got concerns about the disabilities of children.
Disability is the main one, yeah. So I'd like to raise that.
Yeah, I did have that down as looking for opportunities for those who fall under the health category.
Yeah.
And isolated young people.
Although they may not be able to deliver, they may be able to signpost.
Collaborative.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, really, what Stuart was saying there is about, could they align the needs of people with disabilities with the programs they're operating?
It's not
on a recommendation?
It's not just that. There are specific projects that when opportunities are raised with funding, and, you know, because, I mean, there's about 2 or 3, I mean, Gareth's actually really, really good at this as well, but he doesn't necessarily let it detract from his main work. Yeah, but and I think there's... Yeah. But this lady from Colleague Gwent seems to be into it as well. So where there's opportunities for project working or emphasis on it, we welcome that, as long as it's on employment and learning needs.
Looking at who we're tracking, I know that there was a big project on a while back in prisons, and they found that a huge number of prisoners were dyslexic.
Yeah.
So it's an important one to track, isn't
and
it?
Autistic.
So,
Thank you, members.
can
So
we come
I
back
will
to you?
write those out formally and email them to you for
Yeah,
approval
right.
before I send those on to
And
our
before we all go,
officers.
Recording, I got off Gareth, the recording of the data. There's something in there as well. No, not just that. The data tracking is a rather important thing of Dave Leach's thing. Could you put that in as well?
Thank you, members. So I've quickly handed out the pro forma there for the next meeting. You will see that it's about the community safety code and what impact that's had and what areas need further development going forward. They will also... Yeah.
We need to visit.
That's what I was going to ask, whether you had any ideas of what you wanted to visit, who you wanted to speak to.
Yeah.
If you can't think of anything at the minute, obviously please feel free to drop me an email of anything.
I think I agree with... and I mean, perhaps we can have a look and come back to Rebecca as soon as possible so we can get everything before our pre-agenda meeting. I mean, I've got roles. I agree with Veronica. My question was going to be, let's have a visit and see how we're targeting different specific areas. I'm sure Chris has got some on our second area, and we've all... Okay.
Dave, yes, can I just say, given the number of us, I think it would probably be if we went in 2 groups.
Yes.
Because otherwise it's too much, and it's quite a large meeting that takes place on a Wednesday morning.
I'm not sure if you'd actually be able to sit in on a meeting.
I did ask in previous members.
Because of the information they're dealing with, I'm not sure you'd be able to
No, I
actually
did
sit in on a meeting.
as well.
Because I did sit in the new boat when they opened it, but we couldn't sit in it.
Lyndon,
I'll speak with Kate and Lyndon and see who may be able to come along to the meeting, or you may be able to speak with beforehand. Right. That's the agenda.
I was only there because the minister was there.
So our next meeting is scheduled for February?
February.
And we have our pre-agenda on the 4th.
May the 4th be with you.
What time is the pre-agenda?
I might have to give my apologies for that one.